Good morning. I'm Randy Smith. I'm the Illinois River Project Director with the Nature Conservancy based at the Emiquon Preserve. My co-authors are Doug Blodgett and Sally McClure, also with the Nature Conservancy at Emiquon. We're going to talk about evidence for herbivory contributing to declining submerged aquatic vegetation at Emiquon. We've heard quite a bit about some of these factors, but we haven't really touched on what birds or fish might be doing to the amount of submerged aquatic vegetation at the preserve. In quick review, Emiquon has lost much of its submerged aquatic vegetation over the past number of years. We've touched on a variety of causes for this, or potential causes for this, things like turbidity, the density of bottom sediments, effects of drawdowns, fish, and possibly others, things like avian herbivores, or possibly a number of other things that we haven't considered yet. Avian herbivores can be seasonally abundant at Emiquon. Things like American coots can be incredibly abundant. Peak counts have ranged as high as over 100,000 individuals at some times throughout the years. Gadwalls, American widgeon, ringneck ducks, and canvasbacks are all duck species that have been abundant at various times throughout the history of Emiquon. Currently, trumpeter swans are a common avian herbivore that are present throughout late fall, winter, and early spring migration. These large-bodied birds are native to North America, and they consume a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation when it's available. Additionally, mute swans have started calling Emiquon home. These are an invasive species, not native to North America. They breed at the site, and they're present nearly year-round. Thinking a little bit more about the idea of herbivory and when it might take place, our cover mapping takes place at the end of the growing season, but before the onset of fall and winter senescence. So we're trying to capture when vegetation is at its peak. And of course, this work is done by the Illinois Natural History Survey. Of those common and abundant avian herbivores that we just reviewed, really only mute swans are abundant during that pre-cover mapping time period where they could be impacting vegetation that is then mapped during that cover mapping exercise. As a brief review about mute swans, these are large-bodied swans that are native to Europe. They're introduced to eastern North America in the late 1800s and have been expanding westward ever since. They're overabundant in many areas, but not super abundant in the Illinois River Valley, largely because of a lack of their preferred habitat type, which includes submerged aquatic vegetation. Unlike some other species of waterfowl, they're quite aggressive, not only towards other mute swans in defending breeding territories, but also towards other water birds and native waterfowl species. And in some instances, this can lead to exclusion or displacement from preferred habitats of those native and desirable species. Because of their large size, mute swans are voracious eaters. They can consume 6.5 to over 8.5 pounds of submerged aquatic vegetation daily. They also have a pretty unique foraging strategy that is referred to as trampling. So in shallow water, the mute swans will kind of stomp into the bottom substrate and really loosen that up. And that makes it a lot easier to forage on the below ground portions of plants. So the roots and shoots and tubers and seeds and other things like that. This can remove a lot of that vegetation from the system. It can also increase turbidity and really kind of change the bottom profile in some places where swans are really abundant. So they do have the ability to impact the habitat as a whole. There's been some local research on mute swans in the Illinois River Valley. A study conducted by the Illinois Natural History Survey and Southern Illinois University a few years back looked at impacts of mute swans on submerged aquatic vegetation in Illinois River backwater lakes. So this was conducted at Banner Marsh and Spring Lake, which are just north of Emiquon. These are likely the sources of our mute swans at Emiquon. And that study found no measurable change in the vegetation that was within the water column, so between the bottom and the surface, but there was a significant reduction in below ground biomass. The cause for that might be because of the relatively low abundance or low density of mute swans on those lakes, and the fact that there was a really high abundance and density of SAV. The wetlands that were used in that study are virtually solid with submersed aquatic vegetation from the bottom all the way to the water surface. And due to the relatively low density of swans, they were really able to key in on the preferred parts of the plant that they wanted to eat or their preferred food sources. And so they targeted those tubers and roots rather than that portion of the plant that was in the water column. Those below ground portions of the plant are likely more nutritious. So if local studies are showing that mute swans may not have an impact on submerged aquatic vegetation, why are we worried about them at Emiquon? Well, there's a fair amount of other research on mute swans and their impacts, and the results are kind of all over the place. They range from a 95% reduction in submerged aquatic vegetation density to no measurable effects, similar to this study. So there's lots of things that are at play depending on how mute swans can impact the habitat. It seems to depend a lot on the mute swan density, on the size of the wetland, so acreage or the amount of or the area of submerged aquatic vegetation or appropriate habitat anyway, the density of the submerged aquatic vegetation in those habitats, and maybe some other factors as well, maybe how long they're present for, whether they overwinter there, a variety of things. So a whole variety of factors playing into how big of a problem these swans can be at a given site. So specific to Emiquon, we've seen a general increase in the number of mute swans throughout time. The graph in the upper right is taken from aerial inventories conducted by the Illinois Natural History Survey. And there's a general increasing trend, or a pretty significant increasing trend, throughout most of the time that Emiquon has been in existence, from when mute swans first started showing up in 2011. So also going on here, we know we have a reduced area of submerged aquatic vegetation, and we also know that the surrounding landscape generally has very little submerged aquatic vegetation, with the exception of Banner and Spring Lake. So it seems the mute swans at this location might have a disproportionate impact when coupled with carp that are also foraging on vegetation. So it seems that we might be reaching some sort of tipping point because of that already lowered amount of SAV in the system due to possibly some other factors, or maybe these are the primary drivers of it. But it seems that there's potential anyway for herbivores to be having a significant impact on our submerged aquatic vegetation here. So in order to test this idea of herbivory, we wanted to do a little bit of a trial. And now I want to be upfront that this does not have a robust study design. This was really just a qualitative exercise to explore whether herbivory was having any impacts or not. So in summer of 2022, we deployed 11 of these wire mesh exclusion cages. We targeted areas across Emiquon, really kind of across the north part of the site, areas that had pretty good amount of submerged aquatic, and areas that were also lacking submerged aquatic vegetation at the time of deployment. We tried to pair these exclosures, one in really shallow water and one in deeper water. And these had a really relatively small mesh size, about a 1/2-inch mesh. So everything was excluded, or everything that we thought could be a major contributor to herbivory anyway. So no swans were going to get into these, no fish were going to get into these, maybe some invertebrates, maybe some minnows, things like that. But those bigger species that we think might be having the largest impacts were completely excluded. So these were the areas that we targeted, mostly in the north part of Emiquon. These were kind of areas where there isn't a whole lot of public use or anything like that, things that we needed to be worried about for disturbing the exclosures. I guess I should mention the size of the exclosures. They're about 2 feet wide, about 3 or 4 feet long, and about 2 feet deep. We paired most of these, one shallow and one deep, except we had an odd number of exclosures. We had 11, so one of the sites had 3 exclosures in it. So we had a few goofy things going on. In summer of 2022, we really were thinking that water levels were going to come up, or we were hoping they were going to come up anyway, but we had a drought and we lost 8 to 10 inches of water depth from the time that we deployed them in June until we picked them up in October. And so almost all of our shallow exclosures became stranded on dry ground or on mud flat. So there was maybe not a great test there, and moist soil plants instead of submersed aquatic plants grew in many of those exclosures. Our results were fairly variable across our deeper water exclosures, but one thing that seemed to stay consistent was use of our exclosures as raccoon latrines, which was not great when we were trying to retrieve them. So we had some sites with not a lot of difference between inside and outside of the exclosure. So kind of a small effect anyway. And so I'm not going to say that this site had no difference between deployment and retrieval. There's a big difference in the amount of submersed aquatic vegetation there, but there did not seem to be a real big difference between inside and outside of the exclosure. There was a lot of submersed aquatic vegetation outside of this exclosure, and then also quite a bit growing inside of this one. Other sites seem to have fairly substantial effects. So this was one of our deeper sites when we set the exclosures out. And although there's not an absolute ton of submersed aquatic vegetation growing in this one, there's a lot more than there was growing outside of it. And this one's in deep enough water that it could certainly be being impacted by swans, carp, any number of things. This one, the water stayed relatively deep around the exclosure throughout the entire time it was out. This is another site that seemed to have relatively substantial effects. So again, pretty decent water depth at the time of deployment. We visited this one in September as well, and there was quite a bit of submersed aquatic vegetation growing both around the exclosure and within the exclosure. Water levels dropped further between September and October, and this became stranded. Now, if you look on the mud around the exclosure, you can see some of that floating leaf pondweed growing around it, but it seems that the big thing here was the arrowhead growing within this exclosure. And in both the September and October pictures, you can kind of see some other spindly arrowhead growing around it that looks like it's been eaten on quite a bit. So I'm not exactly sure what was going on here. I think it's pretty safe to say this was not carp herbivory, so likely swans or geese or something else targeting these plants in this area. So a few kind of wrap up or discussion points here. I think we have pretty solid evidence for herbivory. However, we don't know if that is if birds or fish are the primary drivers of that. I think it probably depends a lot on water depth and maybe other things like the type of vegetation. We've also talked about if there's any value to establishing some long-term monitoring type of exposure. So something that would be a little bit more permanent, that we could track across water levels and across years and seasons, and to see if there are certain times when things are looking good, or certain times when things are really being impacted heavily. And then we're just talking about what other threats or what other factors might be impacting SAV that we're not thinking of right now. Are we overlooking something? One of the things that we talked about a little bit is whether there could be a carryover from previous seasons that could be impacting the amount of SAV recorded during cover mapping in the fall. And we don't really think that this is the case. When we set these exclosures out in June, we were seeing a really strong response from SAV in several of the shallower areas where we were putting these. And it wasn't just with that floating leaf pondweed that is really abundant and really visible and obvious to see. But if you look closely, there's also a fair amount of other pondweed species that were associated in these areas. So things like sago pondweed and others that have those narrow leaves and are pretty indicative of good habitat and of a good submersed aquatic vegetation response. And so since this was at the beginning of the spring, beginning of the summer growing season, we don't really think that there's an associated carryover effect from that fall, winter, spring migration foraging going on. And some of the research indicates that that might actually stimulate submersed aquatic plant growth in some instances, but we don't think that there's enough to be depressing growth into the growing season after that migration period. With that, I appreciate everybody hanging around and learning a little bit more about some of the things that we've got going on at Emiquon with our plant communities. And I'll leave you with an Emiquon sunrise, one of my favorite views, and looking forward to answering a few questions and having a longer conversation about this during our upcoming panel session here in a little while.